My stepson's grandma made him sleep in her underwear. No one believed me until I saw it for myself. I remember the day my life intersected with my now husband's for the very first time. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a gentle voice and warm eyes, someone who carried the weight of a single father on his shoulders, with both dignity and, at times, quiet exhaustion. We had met, of all places, at a mutual friend's barbecue. I was invited by a coworker, and he was there because he needed to get out of the house. He told me later that he was half thinking about leaving 5 minutes before I walked in, but we were introduced. Chatted about random topics like the best burger recipes and how severely I'd burn a marshmallow if given the chance. We just clicked. I liked how earnestly he listened to me. I liked how he talked about his son with this mixture of fierce pride and a yearning to do better. At the time, I only knew broad strokes about his life. He was widowed. His wife had died when their son was just an infant. He didn't go into detail, and I didn't push. It felt too personal for that first conversation. Over the next several months, as we continued to see each other, I learned just how deeply he loved and missed his wife, but also how determined he was to give his son, who I'll call Kevin, a warm, stable home. Kevin was the sweetest toddler when I first met him, chubby-cheeked, a little shy, but quick to laugh. I discovered new corners of my heart every time I saw him. I fell in love with them both, father and son. Watching Kevin reach for his dad's hand, cling onto him before bedtime, it was so tender and reminded me that life is so fragile. We'd go out to the park or to the aquarium, and sometimes Kevin would look around as though everything was brand new, full of wonder. We'd ride the glass elevator at the Children's Museum, and I could almost see his heart pounding in excitement. I ended up devoting so much time to playing with, reading stories to him, trying to fill some of the motherly role he had never truly known. My husband often spoke about his deceased wife's family as well. He felt strongly that Kevin remained connected to the people who loved his mother, even though she was gone. On the paternal side, Kevin had grandparents who doted on him, but we also wanted him to know something of his late mother's side of the family. That was how the boy's maternal grandmother, let's call her Marilyn, ended up in the picture. Initially, Marilyn lived far away, and Kevin's visits with her were sporadic. A week in the summer here or there, maybe a holiday if schedules aligned. I met her just once or twice in the early years, and though I found her a bit standoffish, I reminded myself that this was the grandmother of a child who'd lost her daughter. I gave her grace and tried to keep an open mind. My husband admitted that she had some strange quirks. She was weird, he said, but harmless. He believed it was right for Kevin to see her and maintain that connection with his mother's family line. As time passed, Marilyn moved closer, an hour or two away at most, and so Kevin's visits with her became more frequent. It started with once every other month, maybe a single night. Then, about a year ago, we settled into a routine, once a month, from Friday afternoon to Sunday evening. We wanted Kevin to have a sense that there was a broader family out there that his mother's memory lived on, in part through his maternal relatives. I had reservations about it all, but nothing I could put a finger on. Call it maternal instinct or call it paranoia. I'd watch Kevin return from a weekend at his grandmother's, and I'd see subtle differences in him. He seemed quiet, a little sullen. At times, he'd react so strongly if I gently asked him how his weekend was. He'd avoid my eyes, and it felt off. My husband would shrug and chalk it up to Kevin being tired, or the after-weekend slump that many kids have, or too much sugar, or staying up late. I forced myself to believe that explanation for a while. Then, as the visits continued, I noticed something practical that set me on edge. The pajamas I'd pack for Kevin would come home unworn. This happened the last 4 or 5 times in a row before I finally asked Kevin directly, "Hey buddy, what do you wear to bed at grandma's?" I tried to keep my voice light and casual, not wanting to suggest that I was suspicious. But Kevin just froze. His face fell, and his eyes darted away from mine. The expression was almost fear. I bent down to meet his gaze, trying to reassure him. "You're not in trouble," I said softly. "I just want to know if you're comfortable or if you forgot to put them on." He hesitated, wringing his little hands, clearly worried. Finally, he whispered, "I just sleep in my underwear." A wave of unease washed through me. "I think you can rationalize a lot of scenarios. Maybe it's too hot in the house. Maybe Grandma forgot to put the pajamas in the hamper." But I immediately felt something was off, because Kevin sleeps in pajamas at home, summer or winter. That's part of his routine and has been for most of his life. I asked where he slept at Grandma's, telling myself he must be sleeping on the couch or maybe the guest bed. But Kevin said, "In her bed with her." My heart beat a little faster as I processed that. "So you sleep in bed with Grandma?" I repeated. "What does Grandma wear?" The question spilled out, and I felt uneasy even saying it. Yet, I had to know. Kevin looked at the floor, rubbing his hands as if he were trying to rub out guilt or fear. He whispered back, "Just her underpants." An adult can piece together the possible implications of that. Could it be completely innocent? Possibly. Everyone has different ideas about modesty and personal space, but Kevin's shame and the fact that he'd come home with unworn pajamas pointed to something else. In my own childhood, I never shared a bed with a grandparent. Maybe on extremely rare occasions if I was frightened by a thunderstorm and sought refuge with them. But even then, We would be wearing pajamas or nightgowns, and at the age of 6, that arrangement would already feel borderline. But strictly in underwear, something just didn't sit right. I confronted my husband as soon as Kevin wandered off to play, because I couldn't get the image out of my mind. Kevin in his small underwear, pressed up next to Marilyn in nothing but underwear. I explained what Kevin had told me. At first, my husband sighed. He said, "Look, that's weird. But my mother-in-law has always been odd. She isn't going to change. She's harmless." It threw me off that he'd be so dismissive. Harmless or not, I'm not comfortable with it, I insisted. He's 6. She can't just have him in bed, both in their underwear. It's confusing for him. It's not appropriate. And he's worried about telling me. That's the biggest red flag of all. The secrecy. My husband eventually agreed we should address it, but he was extremely reluctant to make a big deal out of it. To me, it was a big deal. Why? Because children often can't articulate their discomfort in these scenarios. They just feel something is wrong. And if he's been told, "Don't tell your parents," or if he's picked up on a sense of secrecy, we can't just wave it away. I mulled this over for days. I replayed Kevin's expression, that nervous look, over and over. Finally, I asked him about it again when he returned from his next weekend visit. His reaction alarmed me more than before. He burst into tears, sobbing, "Grandma's couch is dirty. I can't sleep on it. Don't make me stop seeing Grandma." The words tumbled out in an almost panicked voice. He was either under the impression that if he revealed too much, I'd cut off visits, or he'd be in trouble, or his grandmother had threatened something. It unsettled me deeply. I realized I didn't know the state of Marilyn's home. If she did have some level of hoarding or living conditions that prevented Kevin from sleeping on a normal couch or guest bed, that might explain why they shared a bed. But it still didn't explain why neither of them was wearing normal sleeping clothes. My husband said, "Even if we tell her to let Kevin sleep clothed on the couch, how do we enforce that? We're not there." Over many internal debates, I realized the only real solution was to address it with Marilyn direct, or to consider halting visits altogether if the living conditions or sleeping arrangements remained inappropriate. We had to see her place with our own eyes. Was the couch indeed so filthy that it rendered the child physically unable to lie on it? And if so, was that entire environment appropriate for him? I tossed and turned at night, my mind spinning with possibilities. What if Marilyn truly was harming him in some way? The idea chilled me. But was my fear overshadowing a simpler explanation? Like the fact that her dog had full domain over the couch and it was covered in fur or even dog drool, making it uncomfortable for Kevin? Could it be that she was telling him, "Don't let your stepmom and dad know that we share a bed or they'll never let you come back," because she simply wanted to continue that closeness without scrutiny? It felt like a puzzle, each piece half formed by suspicion and scattered by fear. Meanwhile, Kevin was only 6. He had no reason to invent strange details about sleeping arrangements. If he was distressed, it meant something real was happening to him. Psychologically, if not physically. So I posted an anonymous query online, explaining the scenario in broad terms. A 6-year-old boy, a grandmother, both in underwear, bed sharing, the child's sense of secrecy, the filthy or dirty couch in question. The flood of replies was overwhelming. Some told me I was overreacting. Others were shocked and said it was absolutely a red flag. In the swirl of all those opinions, I found reassurance that I wasn't crazy to think this was problematic, and if it turned out to be innocuous, at least I'd have done my due diligence to protect my stepson. I confronted my husband again. "I need you to stand up for Kevin," I pleaded, my voice cracking. "You're his father. We have to do something more than just hoping it changes." He sighed heavily, the lines of worry on his face deepening. "We can tell her no bed sharing," he said. "We can warn her that if she doesn't abide by it, we'll have to stop visits. But he paused. "She's not a normal person. She might just ignore us." "But we won't know unless we physically check the environment," I insisted. "Let's just go the next time we drop Kevin off. See what the couch looks like. See if it really is that dirty. If it is, maybe we can bring an air mattress so there's zero reason for them to share a bed." He flinched at that idea. "Marilyn won't like you snooping around her place," he warned. "She's never liked you anyway." That stung a bit. I knew Marilyn could be cold toward me, maybe even resentful that her daughter had died, and I was now playing wife in her daughter's place. But I didn't care if I was stepping on her toes. Kevin's well-being was my priority, and eventually, after several tense conversations, my husband finally relented. We'd arrange for Kevin's next visit as usual, but we'd drive him there, as a family, and I'd get a look inside. I felt a mixture of anxiety and determination. Kevin was anxious about the trip too, because he'd heard some of the conversations about the couch and bed share. I gently told him, "We're just making sure that everything is clean and comfy for you, kiddo. No one's mad at you. We just want you safe and happy." He nodded mute, but I could see relief in his eyes that maybe we'd take the burden off him. He hated feeling like he was betraying his grandmother by telling on her, or betraying us by not telling us everything. The following Friday rolled around, and we headed to Marilyn's place. She lived in one of those newer townhouse communities where each unit looks more or less the same. Beige siding, white trim, neatly manicured lawns. I followed my husband's car and my own car because I wanted to be prepared to leave at a moment's notice if tensions flared. Kevin sat in my husband's car, hugging his overnight bag. When we arrived, I could see Marilyn's curtains flutter. She was obviously peeking out. Her dog started barking before we'd even knocked on the door. We stepped onto her porch and my husband rang the bell. She answered, and her face fell when she saw me. "Oh," she said, forcing a tight smile. "I wasn't expecting. Usually my son-in-law drops Kevin off alone. What's going on?" I tried to speak politely. "We came as a family because I wanted to see your place. Kevin's been talking about it. I hope that's all right." I forced my own smile, trying to be casual. She huffed a bit, rubbed her arms nervously and said, "Well, everything's kind of messy. I wasn't planning on having visitors inside. You know how it is." I looked her in the eye. "I actually really need to use your bathroom though. I'm sorry. This drive was longer than expected." It was a bit of a fib, but I wasn't above that if it meant checking out the conditions for Kevin's sleeping arrangement. Marilyn looked trapped. She pursed her lips. "There's a gas station down the road. You could use that." My husband quickly interjected. "It'll be fine, Marilyn. Let's just come in for a minute." His voice was firm but polite. This was exactly the scenario we'd predict. She'd try to keep me out. She stepped aside, her mouth forming a thin line, and let us in. I'd braced myself for roaches, piles of trash, an unstoppable stench. My imagination had run wild. But the townhouse's interior was, at a glance, a swirl of tchotchkes, crocheted throws, porcelain figurines, and outdated decor. It was chaotic in the sense that there was so much stuff. Magazines stacked on end tables, artificial flowers placed in questionable arrangements, doilies on every other surface. But it wasn't the horrific hoarder's den I'd envisioned. There wasn't rotting food or animal waste or anything that screamed danger. It was just jam-packed with cheap figurines and clutter. I squeezed through the living room to get to the bath. The dog, a large white one, possibly some Great Pyrenees mix, followed close behind, looking vaguely friendly but protective of its domain. The entire couch, sure enough, was covered in a big fleece blanket that was absolutely coated in dog hair, enough that it formed little clumps in places. Kevin was right. If that was the only place to sleep, it would be extremely unpleasant. You'd be inhaling dog hair all night. I got to the bathroom, flicked on the light, and looked around. The sink area was scattered with half a dozen bottles of lotions, rinses, sponges, half-used bars of soap. The bathtub had a cluster of old shampoo bottles in the corner, a few razors, sponges, loofahs, but nothing truly moldy or disgusting. Baseboards were dusty, sure, but that was hardly a cardinal sin. All in all, it was a messy bathroom, but not an unlivable. I emerged, trying to conceal my confusion. Why is Kevin so desperate not to mention the sleeping arrangement if the house is simply cluttered? Then I noticed the hallway leading to the bedrooms. Marilyn had closed the door, presumably to her sewing, but I saw glimpses of stacked plastic totes and big boxes through the cracks. The place clearly had more clutter than the living room suggested. I suspected that the sewing room wasn't suitable for a child to sleep in, definitely not if it was jam-packed from floor to ceiling. My husband, in his calm but direct manner, told Marilyn, "We wanted to see if there's a place Kevin can sleep other than your bed. We noticed he hasn't been wearing pajamas at night, and we'd like him to wear his pajamas." Marilyn folded her arms. "I don't know what you're implying, but it's quite offensive," she snapped, color rising in her cheeks. "Of course I make him wear pajamas, and the couch is always there for him if he prefers it." I resisted the urge to call her out on the dog hair blanket. Instead, I said, "Kevin's told us he sleeps in your bed with you. We'd rather him have his own space, especially as he's getting older. So we thought we could buy a twin-size air mattress and keep it here so he can sleep comfortably." Her gaze flicked from me to my husband, to Kevin, who was peeking from behind my husband's leg. "Kevin's my grandson," she said softly, a bit of a quiver in her voice. "I want him to be comfortable, but I don't have extra space for an entire bed. This is my sewing," she gestured vaguely, "and it's my livelihood. This couch is the only place." My husband pressed on. "The couch is covered in dog hair," he said gently. "Kevin's not comfortable sleeping on that. So, we'll give you an air mattress. It won't be permanent. You can inflate it when he visits and then Marilyn shuffled her feet. "I don't see why we can't just share the bed," she muttered. "He's a little boy. My own daughter used to crawl in bed with me." She shot me a look that bordered on hostility. Why is this woman so bent on stirring up trouble? I took a deep breath, forcing calm. "Kevin's growing up," I said. "He needs privacy, and so do you. It's important for healthy boundaries. And we've been worried because he seems very uncomfortable talking about bedtime. We just want him to feel safe and not worry about telling us something." Her lips pressed thin again, but she didn't argue further. Then my husband gently said, "We'll bring you the air mattress next time, okay? In the meantime, can we trust that Kevin will wear pajamas? And you'll do the same?" She sputtered. "I do wear pajamas. I wear a nightgown." I don't know where that lie came from. She shot Kevin a sharp glance that made my stomach. She clearly wasn't happy with him, like he'd ratted her out or made up stories. Kevin looked at the ground, possibly fighting tears. I moved over to him and lightly rubbed his back, wishing I could shield him from her glare. At that point, we gathered that there wasn't much more to do than drop Kevin off for the night. I was torn, not wanting to leave him, but I also recognized we'd forced her hand about the pajamas. We'd done what we'd come to do, made a statement about boundaries, and told her we'd be checking in. So we left. All weekend, I was on edge. I kept texting my husband that maybe we should pick Kevin up early. He reassured me that if we called or texted Marilyn too much, she'd only push back more, and Kevin would feel more tension. We had to trust that we'd made ourselves clear. I had half a mind to do a surprise check at 11 p.m., but that would be pure chaos. Sure enough, Sunday evening came, and Kevin came home. He looked a bit subdued, but not nearly as anxious. I immediately noticed that the pajamas I'd sent with him were out of his bag, looking obviously wrinkled as though worn. I felt relief, though part of me worried that Marilyn might have just taken them out to pretend. But Kevin insisted that he'd worn them. "I promise," he said. "Grandma told me to." He said he slept in bed with her. Only one night, but they both wore pajamas. Another night, apparently, he tried the couch for a while. He was still not comfortable with the dog hair, and ended up in her bed again because there was nowhere else. That wasn't ideal, but at least it sounded like more clothes were involved. My husband told me, "We'll bring the air mattress next time. That'll solve the sleeping arrangement issue." I'd be lying if I said my worries vanished overnight, but I did feel we'd taken a step. We had confronted the situation, let her know we weren't oblivious or okay with the previous arrangement. She'd had to face us on it. It might not fix everything at once, but it was progress. Over the following weeks, we stayed consistent. Every time Kevin went over, either my husband or I would bring him inside, mention the air mattress, ask if he had everything he needed to sleep, and remind Marilyn how important it was for him to have his own sleeping space. She pushed back in small ways, like telling us the air mattress was too big, or a hassle, or complaining that it took up her sewing room floor. But we insisted. Kevin started returning home wearing the pajamas, or at least using them enough that they looked slept in. The sense of shame or secrecy in Kevin's eyes gradually lessened. He relaxed. Sometimes he'd still mention that the couch was too hairy, or that the sewing room was too cluttered for the air mattress to be set up properly. So he ended up on the floor in the living room with the mattress, which was at least better than sharing the bed with Grandma in their underwear. He seemed more comfortable telling me about it, which I took as a good sign. If he was no longer terrified of discussing bedtime, that was a major improvement. Now, to be very clear, my stance wasn't that Marilyn was definitely doing something sinister. I simply believed it was inappropriate for a child of that age to share a bed with a grandmother in minimal clothing, especially if the child felt so uncomfortable that he was hiding it from us. Boundaries matter, and children sense when something is off. Even if she hadn't malicious intentions, it was the wrong environment for Kevin. It could create confusion around personal boundaries and consent, and that weighed heavily on me. As for the question of the couch's cleanliness, yes, it was thoroughly draped in dog hair, possibly to a gross degree. Kevin's fear about the dirty couch may have been partially that he didn't want to lie in dog hair, partially that Grandma might have said, "Don't say anything to your parents about sleeping in my bed, or they'll never let you come back." Or maybe a combination. I suspect Marilyn, in her own awkward way, was trying to maintain a closeness with Kevin, and simultaneously worried that if I, as the new wife, saw them bed-sharing, I'd freak out. She was correct, I did, but not without cause. What made me the saddest was the guilt Kevin felt. Children are so sensitive to adults' reaction to unspoken rule. He must have sensed that we found it strange, and perhaps she told him not to mention it. He was placed smack in the middle. I never want him to feel like he has to be a mediator between us. If there was any silver lining to the entire ordeal, it was that it brought me and my husband to a better understanding of how crucial it is for us to stand united for Kevin. In the beginning, he hesitated, downplaying the seriousness. But once he saw how deeply it bothered, and how Kevin's behavior indicated it was more than just a quirk, he took action. He might have done it reluctantly at first, but it mattered to me that he did it at all. He confronted his late wife's mother, which is never an easy conversation. He valued Kevin's emotional and physical well-being enough to risk tension or anger from Marilyn. Now, let's discuss how it all truly ended. The logical conclusion of this entire saga. After a few months of air mattress usage and repeated check-ins, Marilyn grew used to the new arrangement. She still grumbled that Kevin used to share the bed with me when he was small, or that it's perfectly natural for a grandmother and grandson to cuddle. But she stopped fighting us on him wearing pajamas. She also stopped glaring at him for telling the truth. Kevin, for his part, seemed far more at ease. He'd come home from visits without that haunted look, and he'd openly chat about sleeping on the living room floor, on the air mattress, and how the dog would snuggle next to him. One evening, months later, my husband got a phone call from Marilyn. She was surprisingly calm, almost contrite. She said she understood that Kevin is growing up, and that she didn't want him to feel awkward. I was shocked to hear that she asked if we could help her do a thorough cleaning of the couch, and maybe reorganize the sewing room so Kevin could have a cot or small bed in. Apparently, she'd realized that he might visit more often if he had his own space that felt safe. My husband agreed we'd try to help. I was reluctant, but I thought it might be a good step forward, a real sign that she respected our boundaries and wanted to maintain a strong relationship with Kevin in a healthy way. The day we arrived to help was interesting. Marilyn was prickly at first, complaining about the cost of a new vacuum that could handle dog hair, or the time it would take to box up some of her excessive craft supplies. But she let us in, and we methodically set to work. Kevin was a troop, picking up some of the smaller items off the floor. We ended up removing a few boxes from the sewing room, so there was enough space for a small futon or fold-out cot. Over the course of the day, Marilyn kept making remarks that she still thought we were making a mountain out of a molehill. But she never explicitly told us to stop. It was almost as if she needed to save face by protesting, but at the same time, she recognized it was for the best. As we cleaned, I found myself breathing easier, seeing that the place really could be made suitable for a child's overnight stays. Once we vacuumed and replaced the blanket on the couch with a freshly laundered cover, the living room didn't look quite so unappealing. The dog was still going to shed, obviously, but at least it wasn't a mound of fur that spelled instant allergies for a 6-year-old. Kevin was so proud of himself when we set up a small reading nook in a corner of the sewing, just a beanbag, a little lamp, and a couple of picture books. Marilyn lingered near the doorway, frowning as though uncertain of this new arrangement. But then she stepped in, ran her hand over the beanbag's soft fabric, and offered a small nod, as if acknowledging that it was nice for Kevin. That was the day I realized maybe we could coexist with Marilyn in a more constructive way. We didn't have to be best friends, but we had to find a stable, healthy dynamic for Kevin's sake. If in the end Kevin was safe, physically and emotionally, that was all I needed. From that point onward, the visits continued. Kevin's sleeping arrangement was stable, sometimes in the sewing room on the fold-out cot, sometimes, if he chose, on the couch if it wasn't too covered in dog hair, but never again in bed with Grandma wearing only underwear. I won't pretend that Marilyn transformed into a neat freak or overcame all her quirks. She's still the same person, with the same clutter. But the big difference is that Kevin's boundaries are being respected. I still recall vividly the fear and apprehension I felt at the beginning, worrying about the worst possibilities. I stand by what I did. Whether it was an innocent oversight on Marilyn's part or something more complicated, Kevin's discomfort was real. We addressed it by being direct, by setting non-negotiable boundaries, and by physically verifying the environment. Ultimately, that's our duty as parents and step-parents, to ensure that children are in safe, age-appropriate situations. Sometimes I think about how many families might have small, subtle red flags that they ignore because they fear confrontation. I'm grateful that I pushed, that I advocated for Kevin, because in the end, if we had let it go, if we had just said, "Oh, it's probably fine," Kevin would have felt unsupported. He might have internalized the idea that he had to keep secrets to preserve relationships. And that's the kind of dynamic that can become very dangerous if left unchecked. Throughout this entire journey, I learned several lessons. Children's discomfort speaks volumes. Even if a scenario seems harmless to an outsider, if a child is visibly distressed or secretive, that needs to be addressed head-on. Boundaries are important. Families have different norms, but certain boundaries, particularly around bodily autonomy and sleeping arrangements, are essential for a child's sense of safety, communication, and follow-through. It wasn't enough to say we disapproved. We had to take action, physically seeing Marilyn's home, insisting on changes, the air mattress, cleaning the couch, and monitoring the situation over time. Don't let the fear of confrontation overwhelm the need to protect a child. My husband was hesitant to upset Marilyn, but ultimately, Kevin's well-being trumped any discomfort or social awkwardness. Now that Kevin is a bit older, he just turned 7 recently, the monthly visits continue in a more or less peaceful routine. He packs his pajamas, a favorite stuffed dinosaur, and a couple of books, and I remind him he can call us anytime if he feels uncomfortable. He usually rolls his eyes at me in that endearing, semi-exasperated way kids do when they feel you're coddling. But then he gives me a hug, and I ruffle his hair, and he climbs into the car. When I pick him up, the pajamas are worn and often a bit stinky because he's a typical boy who might have had a messy weekend, but they're worn. He no longer hesitates or cries when I ask how his night went. Sometimes he tells me funny stories about how Grandma's dog tried to share the air mattress with him. Sometimes he says how Grandma made him a big breakfast, and sometimes he just shrugs and says it was fine, in that short little kid way that indicates normalcy. That's all I wanted, for him to be safe, to be comfortable, and to maintain a relationship with his grandmother without shame or secrecy. I may never be close with Marilyn. She still harbors some lingering resentment toward me, I suspect, for stepping into her daughter's shoes. But that's not what this story was about. It's about Kevin, and ensuring he grows up in an environment where he's respected, loved, and protected. We haven't threatened to cut off visits again because it hasn't been necessary. Marilyn is not perfect, but we've laid down the law, and she's following it well enough. If new issues arise, we'll address them as we did before. But for now, this is where the story ends. Peaceful enough, with Kevin returning from visits smiling, wearing pajamas, and hopefully no longer burdened by confusion. That, in my eyes, is a logical, happy conclusion. And if anyone reading this wonders whether it's overkill to worry about something like bed sharing and underwear, trust your parental instincts. In my case, it led us to reestablish boundaries that keep Kevin out of potentially troubling scenarios. Even if nothing overtly inappropriate was happening, it's best to err on the side of caution and give children the space and respect they deserve. No matter how awkward it might feel to question a relative's behavior, it's our responsibility as caregivers to ensure a child's comfort, physical safety, and emotional security. For me, that's the last word on the matter. I fought for Kevin, and I believe it was worth it. He's blossoming into a confident, bright, silly kid, and I'd like to think this incident, resolved as it was, taught him he can trust us to look out for him, to believe him, and to step in when something feels off. We may not have the perfect family dynamic, and we certainly have our baggage, but we do love him fiercely. I hope he remembers that always, that his parents and step-parent will fight tooth and nail to keep him safe, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us with other adults in his life.